starting from my left here, we've got Dr. Melanie Thompson. She's a microbiologist and an immunologist, a researcher at Geelong University Hospital. She's also been a very passionate voice of women in STEM with that extra M on the end. And since the diagnosis of her son with high-functioning autism and her own diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, she's been a vocal advocate for disability inclusion and raising awareness of the challenges at the intersection between disability and gender. And she also serves on the Steering Committee for Women in Science Australia. And she has in front of her a couple of documents which are available after the session. One is high-level statistics. Pardon?
That's me.
Oh, that's you, sorry. My apologies.
I could get some documents for you now. Yeah.
I got terribly confused. You'll have to excuse me. So she doesn't have these documents.
No.
She has these documents. Next, we have Kimberly Olson. And thank you for filling in for Dawn, who wasn't going to be able to make it. There was a last-minute change you might have noticed in your programs. And she's a manager with ACON's Pride Inclusion Programs. Now, am I correct that ACON stands for the AIDS Council of New South Wales?
It did, but we've changed it simply to ACON.
To ACON.
We do much more than HIV now. So.
Yeah, that makes perfectly good sense. Yeah. So ACON's Pride Inclusion Program, which incorporates pride and diversity. In her role, she assists organizations with all aspects of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex, LGBTI inclusion. And she has extensive background in training development, business development, project management, and she assists with a broad range of organizations within the LGBTI inclusive strategies, including organizations in the private, public, and higher education sectors. So she has good firsthand experience of some of the how-do strategies that we're out after in this session. And then also we've got Professor Jill Milroy. She's from the Palyuka people in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. Have I pronounced Palyuka properly?
That's Palgu.
Palyu.
Nothing like it spelled.
Say it again.
Palgu.
Palgu. She's the Dean of School of Indigenous Studies and Executive Director of the Post Centre for Indigenous Studies, the University of Western Australia. And her key research interest is Aboriginal knowledge, story systems, and the rights of Aboriginal children to be born into stories. She became a member of the Order of Australia, yet again, in 2011. Professor Milroy serves on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Advisory Council and was chair on the Indigenous Engagement and Science Report. And let's see, who are we missing here? So we've got Melanie, we've got
David.
David, yeah. There he is at the very end. I don't have to introduce him, thank goodness. And so, as I say, this section isn't going to be strictly of the previous format, but I want to ask David a question to start, and that is, you say you're not the father of Athenas STEM. Could you tell us a little bit about who established the organization and why? What were the circumstances?
Well, it's murky, but around 2005, some key leaders, Dame Athene Donald, I think the coincidence of the similarity of the first name is simply a coincidence, but Athene Donald, who's I think a physicist in Cambridge, Dame Professor Julia Higgins, who's a inorganic chemist, I think, at Imperial, now retired, and a number of other very, very eminent senior women academics came together and used, frankly, their political clout to call for a systemic change program. I obviously wasn't there at the time, so I had nothing.
So you don't know what the circumstances were that triggered it?
I know that ECU, because we are the higher education sector's Equality and Diversity Agency, we got involved to do the groundwork and research, along with other agencies as well. And we got quite a lot of funding at that time to do it. So I think, in a nutshell, that's what happened.
Now, given that this section is called Intersectionality in STEM, although you touched on it in your presentation, would you give a clear definition of what we're talking about here, David?
Well, intersection, we actually have a definition. I brought one with me from ECU. Maybe I'll use that. Sorry. One is, this is a better one. Intersectionality means recognizing that people's identities and social positions are shaped by several factors which create unique experiences and perspectives. That's essentially it. But if I may just add, I probably said this earlier, I think that I don't know if you have this term BME in Australia, black and minority ethnic. I know that the particularities in Australia are different with your history and with your Aboriginal community and Torres Island communities. But we use BME, which is a kind of clumsy term to mean non-white. People from a variety of heritages. But if you look at non-white professors, particularly British professors, it's not straightforward. If you look at British Caribbean heritage professors, there are tiny numbers. And there's some embarrassingly low number of British black Caribbean heritage women professors. So when you fold in more than one identity, you really illuminate where the disadvantage and underrepresentation arises. And I think that we do a disservice if we don't do that. So, for example, if you look at gender inequality, actually one demographic that does very well at undergraduate level are middle-class women. They do much better than working-class women, and certainly much better than working-class black women. So intersectionality is just a recognition that oppression or disadvantage or experiences of marginalising is A, more than on a single identity level, and B, needs to be understood in the round in order to reach for a richer picture of what the issues are and therefore what you can do about it.
In other words, there's a cultural background that explains part of the reason why people are in certain circumstances. Is that what you're saying?
Partly. I mean, this discussion about the difference between sex and gender, I mean, all identity is a construct, and sex
like
obviously
gender.
isn't. Yeah, and so these constructs play out in different ways, and we need to understand them in an interconnected way.
And Jill, you chaired the Indigenous Engagement and Science report for what is now the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. Your report identified that Indigenous knowledge has contributed significantly to research in Australia in the past and continues to do so today. What are some of the contributions and how might we better harness innovation from Indigenous talent in STEM?
I'm not sure where to start in that. I do want to start by just paying my respects to the traditional elders of this beautiful country that we're in and recognising that I do have a couple of Indigenous colleagues in the audience, James Ward and Margaret Raven, and if there's anyone else that's Indigenous Aboriginal that's here, hello, because I don't think there's many of us in the room and probably under the prescribed percentage. In terms of Indigenous knowledge, I think that the key issue from an Indigenous point of view, and I'm just going to say Aboriginal. Indigenous in Australia we use this to refer to Torres Strait Islanders and Aboriginal. I'm Aboriginal and I'm going to speak sort of from that perspective. I think one of the issues that we have is Aboriginal people have contributed, but that contribution isn't recognised in a scientific sense or in an academic sense. And then I think when we approach, I'm very in favour of this Athenas one. I think it's a great program. I'm very interested in it, and also the other charter. Not that we'd take it on wholesale, but I'm very interested in it. But when we have two issues, one is around Indigenous knowledge and one is around Indigenous people, and they both obviously interact. The biggest challenge for Indigenous people is the lack of recognition, valuing or respect for Indigenous knowledge as a knowledge system, and particularly the disrespect of that or undervaluing of it in the academies. Not just the science academies or the what we're talking about, or the STEM area, but also in the arts and humanities and social sciences, and that also to a large degree. And so the big challenge, I think we've got two challenges. One's around what we might call Indigenous knowledge, or which we'll label Indigenous science for the purposes of STEM, and the other is around how do we get Indigenous people into science, because a lot of our young people are interested in becoming scientists and interested in the whole field and engagement. And I think we have a different roadmap to achieve both those ends, though they're clearly interconnected. Because unless we start recognising and valuing Indigenous knowledge in the academies, then we actually won't get the full range of Aboriginal people wanting to come through and do it. So when we look at that, I think there's a strong interconnection, and we're talking about a different thing. The other issue, I think, around something like this and intersectionality is Aboriginal people sort of end up as a little subset in all of this, race into culture. So they're one of the, and I'm sorry, I just call it the odds and sods in the end, because we just sort of get added in. And part of this is a fair go and equality agenda and a human rights agenda about what's fair for everybody. But Aboriginal people are arguing, a bit greedy, we are, arguing for not just a human rights agenda, but on top of that, an Indigenous rights agenda, which in a sense, in Australia, is a privileged place to be. And because that is the direct connection to land and a particular set of rights, which is the right to have our own knowledge system valued and to learn if you want both knowledge systems. But we can't do that unless we resource them equally. Aboriginal people don't just want ours. Like yours, got some fun bits in it. I really like it. Love my car, love my TV. Like history, like medieval history and a whole heap of things like that too. And I think, and we want ours equally, but I think we also would like non-Indigenous people to want and like ours too. Because unless you want and like ours too, it probably doesn't have a future because there's not enough of us to sustain it. So I think the challenge is a bigger challenge. So we'll get something by this. Changing gender equality in STEM is not going to solve the issue for Indigenous people, because the gender equality will help with some things, but not with the broader issue of how Aboriginal people get recognised.
Well, theoretically, then, the STEM program can, as has been said before, can expand and start including different groups and different issues and different questions.
I don't think it's just a question of expansion. I think it might be a question of a different approach as well. So it's having a completely different approach because it's addressing one aspect of the issue, but not the whole.
What are some of the key points about that one approach, that different approach?
I just think recognising Indigenous knowledge. We already do it, and people have had some interesting stories up, but someone talked about, I forget, one of the early speakers talked about they work on deep time and look at rocks. Well, Aboriginal stories from the Pilbara...
Suzanne O'Reilly.
Susan, was it? So Aboriginal stories from the Pilbara, and everyone knows the concept of the dreaming, so the dreaming in the Pilbara has got a particular term from Injibandi people called mungani. And what that translates as, when the earth was soft. It's actually about the formation of the crust. In the Pilbara, the oldest rocks in the world are in the Pilbara. So we need to marry that story up. Aboriginal people have stories about all the tsunamis that came through and can tell you as far as they went and take scientists to where they are. They have stories about Wolf Creek crater. Where did the meteor come? When did the meteor come? And what? It's a star story. It's about that. And so rainbow serpent stories about water. So it's a lost opportunity if we don't take this. And the biggest thing for attracting Indigenous students into science, they want to do it anyway, they want to do this, but getting them to stay and wanting a career in science is relevance and making it relevant to them. And I think that's where we have to have it. So we think we need, this is great, because Aboriginal women do face double jeopardy, if you like,
yes,
around this, or triple jeopardy, because they've got low SES as well often. That's one aspect of it, but it's not going to succeed well enough if we don't do the other.
And
that's
would
a
you
big
explain
culture
the
shift.
Documents that we've got here? These are yours, are they not?
No, they're not.
Whose are they? Oh, yours.
Yours. I could try and explain them, but I don't think I'd be very good.
But let me turn to Melanie now and ask, what are some of the structural barriers that scientists face in managing disabilities in STEM careers? You've got a couple that you have to manage.
I've got a couple now, and I don't look like I do. If people saw me walk up here in my stilettos, you wouldn't, by looking at me, know that I have challenges, and that's a challenge in itself, in the fact that people make assumptions about my abilities or not, depending on what I tell them about my challenges. And it's interesting, and working in a medical school, you tend to get people making assumptions based on their clinical training, which can be a bit sort of paternalistic, to say the least. But if you're talking about a sort of general structural barriers, you've sort of got the cultural structural barriers in Australian science, where as an early career researcher, you're expected sort of to finish your PhD and then go and find your rock star lab somewhere at Harvard or Yale or Oxbridge and go and do a fabulous postdoc, getting amazing papers so that you can then boomerang back to Australia to then try and set up an independent research laboratory. Now, I didn't do that because I basically went round that system by marrying a British man straight after honours. So I actually left. I graduated on the Wednesday, got married on the Sunday. I was in the British High Commission on the Monday getting my visa to emigrate to the previous European country of Britain. I don't know. Is it still in Europe at the moment?
I haven't heard.
Could
someone check and let us know?
So what's the status? It's out, right? Oh dear.
The UK is out?
The former European country in Britain.
Sorry.
So yeah, so
You right, Dave?
It's okay, Dave.
This is a good place for immigrants.
It's okay, yeah. Claim asylum. But basically, I went round the system by moving to the UK as a new graduate, and I worked as an RA at Great Ormond Street Hospital and then at the Leeds Cancer Research UK Centre before then trying to get back into the academic track, as it were. And so I then did all of my postdoctoral training in the UK, and I was very lucky to be present at the start of Athenas STEM. I was at the University of York, which was the very first university that was given a bronze award. I was working on biochemistry, so I was working between the chemistry department, which was the first to get a gold award.
Yeah.
And I would say that actually the Royal Society of Chemistry in the UK was doing lots of stuff pre-2005 for gender equity. And at York, basically the ghost of Dorothy Hodgkins is just, she walks
Really?
the
She
walls
walks the
there.
halls.
She walks the halls, and it is absolutely her legacy that has driven that change.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is actually the basis of what then happened. And so I was there for that, and I watched it happen. I was interviewed by, I think there's some of your staff now, when they were doing their masters about, my future trajectory as a woman in science back in 2004 when I was a master's student. And so I came through a different route. But because I had this mythical overseas work experience, I was seen as a good person to have on a team in a university. And so that was a strength of my application when I applied to Deakin to start my lab there.
Well, we can't all have your experience and graduate and get married the next day to someone whose citizenship we desire and is useful to our career. Can you, given your experience...
I never took a British citizenship, never.
Do you have any suggestions? I mean, concrete, ... This is what you could do.
And it is, and the suggestion is that there is the cultural... You've got to recognise that there's cultural structural barriers, and there's also actual structural barriers. And I will tell an anecdote when I had to design my new lab with the architects and the team, and I said, we need to have a wheelchair accessible sink and lab bench. And they were like, well, that's not in the Australian standards. And I went, I don't care what's in the Australian standards. I want a disabled person who may want to come and work here to think that we have actually thought about them in this process. And so there is actual, ingrained structural barriers, like literally structural, at the Australian standards for how you design a lab level barrier if you're a person with a disability, if you have access issues, for example. And ironically, they put the sink in the wrong place in my lab, and I had my MS diagnosis after I had that conversation, and I basically said to the project manager who had changed, I said, I'm just ringing to check that disabled sink and the lowerable lab bench has been fitted as I requested on the design committee, because it turns out that I might need it. I am the person that might need it now. And there was sort of a, oh yes, yes. And when I entered the lab, that you can actually come and see in my lab, there's a line on the wall where they'd fitted it at the standing height for an able-bodied person, and they had to move it down at my askance, basically. And so there really is those barriers. And so you need to, that needs to be addressed. The cultural structural barriers as well as the actual structural barriers to that. So
this is something that people need to keep in mind when they want to engage.
Yeah, but I mean, the fact that I had to have an argument
Yeah, no, that's shocking.
in a design committee when I was advocating for disabled people, even at that point I considered myself able-bodied, I shouldn't have had to have those arguments.
No,
No.
no. So this is something people will have to face, and they'll have to learn to ask for
Yeah.
some of the things with great effort.
Yeah.
Now, Kimberly, we're going to get to the stats. Pride and Diversity undertakes an annual survey of institutional members and their workforce. What are some of the key statistics from the higher education and government sector that speak to the intersections of gender and sexuality?
Yes, so what's interesting about these statistics when it comes to the higher education sector is that we can see that, that when we pose the question, do I personally support LGBTI inclusion? In the higher education sector, that's 94.7%, and it's much higher than in the other sectors. But when we get down to the realities of the lived experience, am I out to my manager? And those kinds of questions, that higher education actually performs worse. So that's something that's really quite interesting out of the stats. I will speak later to those intersectionalities, but this data is relatively new because we've only just completed the survey. We haven't been able to drill down about those intersectionalities in this particular lot of data. But there is some very common points that we know, and I'll speak to those a little bit later if I can. But something that's quite interesting is that lesbian, bi, trans and queer women are less likely to be out and more likely to be bullied and harassed in the workplace than gay men and others. So I think that's some interesting points to come out of that. Can I also say that as a transgender woman, I'm quite honoured to be speaking here today about these kinds of things, and I'm hoping that perhaps I misheard Professor Koopman before. What we are actually speaking about is gender, and I'm a very good example of why we're speaking about gender. And to speak about sex devalues the lived experience of people like me who have had the pleasure of male privilege and have given it away. And if you think privilege is invisible to those who possess it, you better believe it's really visible to those who lost it.
Yeah, good point. Whew. You could squeak the little lemur there. Yes. Are there any other points you'd like to highlight? Any other stats? And people, again, you can pick up copies up front.
Yeah, so, they're very high-level stats at this point in time. And, I think it's just very interesting that the stats for being bullied are quite low compared to one sector at least. They're kind of mid-ground compared to the other sectors. So we're talking about private sector, we're talking about public sector and higher education. But it's interesting, though, that, as I said, I feel confident my manager would address inappropriate behaviour, not so good performance. I'm out to my manager sexually, much lower than in other sectors. So we're talking about, about 10 or 11% difference in some cases, 8% difference in other cases. So it's a significant amount when we're talking about numbers of, 70%.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. Jill, Indigenous contribution, you touched on this earlier, is not always acknowledged or valued as a scientific contribution. This is a significant waste of potential for Australian STEM, with an M, especially when you consider that Indigenous women make up a tiny minority of university-qualified scientists. Yet Indigenous people are widely involved in the STEM workforce, for example, in land management, environmental science, Indigenous health, and other areas of traditional knowledge. What strategies can senior leaders and managers undertake to better recognize a diversity of culturally relevant career paths and contributions to STEM, especially for women?
It's a difficult question. I do want to raise, so I'm going to give a little example of one of the issues that we talk about a large STEM workforce in communities. A lot of that is actually male rather than women in communities, and I think that's because a lot of the bent of scientists or scientists that go out there are often male. So in a sense, sometimes that system reinforces the fact in the community where Aboriginal women are not recognised, and Aboriginal women's knowledge isn't as well recognised as Aboriginal men's knowledge. And this is an issue for Aboriginal communities in a way, because we've, in a sense, taken on this system, this patriarchal system to some extent that's been introduced colonially. But in fact, what we do is we have Aboriginal people doing the work. So one of the, and I'm giving not an example from science, but from rock art. UWA has a rock art centre which works a lot, and most people are aware of Aboriginal rock art, which is fairly amazing. So as an example, so the community's concerned with that, particularly the older people who have the knowledge about what it means, who work very happily alongside archaeologists and others who work in the field, and we'll date it using chemistry now, and we'll do a whole heap of things like that. But one of the things they always say to me when they come down is how come they get the recognition about the rock art when it's my story? How come they're presenting at the conference and I'm not, or I'm sitting in the audience? Now, they don't read the paper that gets written because it's very technological or very scientific, and it's in a place where Aboriginal people won't access it. But one of the things that really says to them, why aren't then I a professor? Why aren't I recognised for my knowledge, which would be as a PhD? Now, the academies and that won't recognise this necessarily either, because there is no track record, there is no substantive, there is no thing. So how are universities going to deal with that?
This is this metrics problem.
This
again.
metrics problem, but also they don't want to be in a uni, they want to be in the community. This is what recognising Indigenous knowledge system might be about. We would have professors that are in the community, not professors of practice necessarily, could be professors of practice in a uni, but how are we going to do that? And this also then is worse for women than it is for men.
Yeah,
so there will
for
be
sure.
for Indigenous women, because it's less valuable to us, or seen as less valuable to us. And scientists still want to work on issues, often not women's issues or not Aboriginal issues, but there's a lot of issues around that. But Aboriginal people have massive knowledge. They're providing all the knowledge around fire, how we use fire in Australia, which must be one of Australia's biggest issues going. They have lots of knowledge on water, taxonomies on water, long-term knowledge about water, climate. And we don't harness or use that, and Aboriginal people want to contribute, but it has to be recognising people as equals and as partners. And the biggest thing we can give to Aboriginal kids is going to solve a lot of problems, not just the science problem, but Aboriginal people need to see that their elders are valued in the system that they have to live in, not just valued in their own system. So if you value Aboriginal people in the systems they're living, and Aboriginal people can live in the system they want to live in, it has a huge impact on children and girls and boys coming through. And we're all aware of the massive problems in Aboriginal communities, but we don't solve them in a creative way. And I think higher education and the academies could have a really good go at this by just elevating the debate to understanding not the deficit model we have of Aboriginal Australia, but the contribution model, and an understanding that if you're Australian, or you live here, or you're born here, or you want to live here, like David might soon. And if you've got kids in particular, this is everybody's inheritance, and everybody needs to be connected through Aboriginal knowledge to the country they're associated
And are
with.
you making these suggestions available to the Academy, to the powers that
Well,
be? Because clearly it's a bottom-up problem as well as a top-down
It is, but
problem.
it's a shift in thinking for the whole lots of the Academy as a whole. So it's doing all the things. It's always doing the bit on the ground, the actual barriers that are there, what enablers can you put in place. I mean, none of us are going to differ on that. They're all the same. The content's different, but the approach is the same, you know. Remove the barriers, put the enablers in, and you know, everyone has to approach. I like the bit about let's be honest. Let's be honest in our reporting. We're less honest because we don't want to be criticised, but be honest. But yes, it's all out there. It's been out there for a while, and one of the earlier speakers said, we actually know what to do. We know what to do in disabilities. We just have to do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the big message. I will make one other comment, which is too about Aboriginal people don't see themselves easily in the equity agenda. I sort of said that before.
In the what?
In an equity agenda.
Oh, in an equity
so
agenda.
We think it's a separate agenda. And we do participate in this, it's important, but I think it's a separate agenda. Can be part of this, but it's this plus, not that instead of this or this instead of that.
Melanie, to come back to you for a minute.
Yep.
most institutions have extensive anti-discrimination policies in place, and this builds on what you were saying earlier, but these don't always address the gender equity and diversity issues faced with scientists who are managing disability of whatever stripe. What are some of the particular issues you see for women and gender minorities with disabilities trying to build a STEM career, particularly key transition points from the PhD to the postdoc, and then from early to mid-career?
Yeah. So I would just want to talk about the existence of governance for anti-discrimination policies, and touching on something Kimberly said, which is there's a lot of high-level policy that are excellent at most institutions that in higher education and research. But it's actually what happens at the coalface that is actually impacting day to day on people that have these challenges.
Exactly, like your sink.
Absolutely. My sink, for example, is a perfect example. But if the people that are managing you at the coalface are not addressing your needs or being proactive about that, it can be a little bit, we come back to that concept of if you're not deliberately being inclusive, you're, unintentionally being excluding of those people. And so I think we need to understand that you need to actually have programs in place, and you need to make sure that it's happening at the coalface. It's not okay just to have all these fabulous policies on your website when there's actually people at the coalface feeling that they're being discriminated against, even if just by neglect, rather than neglect of their needs. And they may identify, and I have identified I've had a couple of health issues in the last 18 months, which I have identified to my line managers, but they weren't necessarily proactive in asking me what I would require to address and make it basically be the enablers. I don't think that quite happens. There's a bit of a disconnect between the sort of high-level governance and then what happens at the coalface. And I think that particularly for early mid-career women in STEM, we obviously have the gendered, if you're interested in having children, for example, and I have 2 children, and I took maternity leave at the very beginning of my my contract at Deakin because I arrived pregnant. I took the job on a Thursday and found out I was pregnant on the Sunday.
You do things with one day notice, don't
it's
you?
always in the same week. Always in the same week. Never a dull moment. And that impacted on me because even an employer of choice for women would only give me 3 weeks maternity leave based on the fact that I'd only worked for the institution for 3 months. And in fact, if I looked up all the other institutions' policies, and perhaps if I worked at some other G of 8 institutions, which I won't mention, I would have had to go back to work that morning because I wasn't entitled to any leave.
Yeah.
And I am the breadwinner for my family. My husband is a stay-at-home dad.
See what you got for marrying a Brit.
Well, that's it. He was a British policeman. Now he's out of work. But he's my stay-at-home partner. So, yes.
Now, what I'd like to do next is build on some of these ideas that have been presented. But first, I would like to have David comment on what you have been hearing so far. What are some of the key points that have been raised in the discussion so far, and the key factors that institutions might consider when addressing these intersections of gender, race, sexuality, disability, Indigenous states?
I mean, the first thing I'll say is I left my country on Wednesday and have now just discovered that it's floated to the mid-Atlantic. So probably a bit like really 3 days later or 2 days later. Yeah. I think all of these issues, seriously, I think all of these issues lend themselves to consideration of where power lies. Often, I'm asked, is there an indefinite list of identities which we have to have regard to? My short answer is no. So I don't know what was happening in Australia at the time of the international economic crash, where bankers were given a hard time in many countries, including my country, for...
They got off pretty well scot-free here.
Okay. Have a GFC, no problem.
Right. And somebody said, well, I mean, they were purportedly being given a hard time in the UK. They weren't really being given a hard time, but they were being criticised. And somebody said, well, maybe bankers should be a protected characteristic that requires consideration. And now, I mean, I think it's obviously a facetious argument, but there is an important point behind it about what do we mean by identity. And I think you can only understand these things in historic structural relationships of exclusion. So that's why, and actually I don't think that you can make progress at all unless you understand historic arrangements which result in the privileging of some people and the disprivileging of other people. And that will lead you to a probably better understanding of sexism and racism and homophobia and disablism and so on. And I love talking and thinking about those things, at least in theory, although it's then harder to translate them into practice. But I know there are complexities. I'm very interested in the point that you said about Aboriginal peoples not considering themselves part of the diversity, and I'd love to listen to you more about what that means, because there are clearly nuances there which I don't know about in this context. But what really I would push for is, and I really like the comment this morning about disruption. I mean, the thing that's difficult to talk about is if you're going to remove privilege or equalize privilege, some people are going to be disadvantaged. So if the academies under Margaret and Sue are making a push to have a greater number of women members appointed each year, assuming the total number that they can appoint is fixed, that means that some men may not be appointed, if simply it's a question of maths, really. And I think we do ourselves a disservice to pretend that that's not the case, because we then avoid seeing where the resistance is, and there will be resistance.
Loss of power is a real problem.
So that's my probably overstated first point. My second point is, once you understand or have some understanding, at least try to understand what the historical nature of exclusion is, it then allows you to think about intersectionality better. It allows you to see where the links are and where the pinch points are, if you like. I like to talk about leaky pipelines because it's sort of a way of sort of graphically demonstrating where the problem is in a life spectrum. It allows you to think about those things more easily, and then consequently what the remedy is, or a remedy, or what the programs or initiatives are. So it's very interesting to hear everybody's perspectives from that point of view, and I think it's, what I would say is, in an ideal world, one other thing. In an ideal world, we would have a holistic set of arrangements which would address all of these things. For a long time, I and my team thought about, do we want to develop a systemic change charter covering all marginalised groups? So one instrument that tried to address disadvantage or underrepresentation on all of those 9 protected categories that I mentioned.
Within the academic framework.
In an academic framework. But we decided against it because we just don't know enough. So, for example, we know something about how LGBTIQ people are disadvantaged in higher education. But we don't know enough to know that there's underrepresentation. More of the issues are around harassment or exclusion in other ways. And we weren't able to pull together something yet in a way which is manageable by the sector. So there's a pragmatic approach, which is what can we do now, what do we understand and what can we do now, and the theoretical approach, which is how can we keep thinking about this and moving forward.
Thank you. Now, given this is a very good summation comment about what we've been talking about, we've got time for just a couple of questions. Do I see any hands up? Yes, to my left. If we could get a microphone down, please. Oh, here. Lady in the grey jacket.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Anna Carew from the University of Tasmania. I'm finding this a very challenging conversation because intersectionality is a relatively new set of concepts for me. I'm going to perhaps ask you to swing it round to a personal perspective, which would be very, very relevant to many of the people in this room. When we choose to step forward within our organisations to further gender equity, in some ways we push back our own intersectionality professionally and personally. And I'd be really interested to know how you have managed that dance between this issue that you step forward on and care about and the richness of who you are as people, and also your own career aspirations independent of this particular issue or cause.
Could we start with Kimberly?
Yeah, I'm not...
That's a tough one.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I guess the interesting thing for me is I've never really had to think about separating that out. I mean, it's fairly obvious for a transgender woman that these things are stuck together, but for a lot of the LGBTI community, they separate these things out all the time. And because they're not out, right? So you can be a woman and a lesbian, but you don't share that second piece of information that I'm a lesbian, right? For fear of what will happen. And that might point to what you're talking about, David, about we don't have this data because people won't identify, right? But for me, you know, I'm still in that very lucky space where I'm finally allowed to be who I always was. And so for me, that's all just stuck together with my experience of work. So I'm not sure I could really comment beyond that. You know, for me, it's a friend of mine, Joanna Ferrari, calls what I'm experiencing gender euphoria.
Oh,
You know, as opposed to...
stop when you're ahead.
Yeah. So, you know, as opposed to gender dysphoria, I should point out.
Well, exactly.
Yeah. So, yeah, for me, I'm not sure I could think about it like that.
Jill?
Yeah.
No, I'm a bit like that. I think it's, but I also think this is a particularly Western way of looking at the world, which is to tend to see things as good, bad, better, worse. It's always much dichotomous, you know, either or, always about making choices. Aboriginal society and Aboriginal systems always move to the whole, and they always move in multiplicities, happy to have multiplicities. And an example of that I often give is some of the most traditional Aboriginal communities practice all their traditional things, very strongly traditional communities, will also be the most Christian communities and see no problem between either of those systems and move fluidly in and out them and move fluidly between spirit, mind and body. So a spiritual understanding of something is not separate, they're all continuous. And so I think we see it more as continuous, that you're moving to one end or the other a bit at the time. And I think in a sense, if we had to characterise it or how I would do it, because I have to wear many hats and working in a university, is the whole is always Aboriginal Australia. The subset might be working on the gender issue at this stage, or the subset might be working on getting young people in and that. So it tends to be that way rather than that being the driving force. But I think work in multiplicities is probably how we'd characterise it.
Melanie?
So for me, it happened organically that I added these extra portfolios to my the hits that have basically happened in my life. And obviously I was born a woman and I identify as a woman. And I've always been an advocate for women's issues, even from a very young age. But then I had my son was diagnosed with autism, and then I became a disability advocate as a parent. And then I was diagnosed, and then it came home, and I'm like, well, actually now you better get that sync in the right place for me. Not some mythical person that we were mythically talking about, it's now for me, it's now personal. And I've come across, it's interesting that I get tone policed on different bits of my speaking out. I'm encouraged to speak out as a woman about women's gender issues. I'm encouraged to speak out as a person with MS, for example, talking about, you know, stem cell quackery, which I have done for the Australian Academy of Science. But then when I spoke earlier this year about having mental illness, that's when I started to get pushed back. And it was very unedifying that I was getting pushed back from my own department for saying that admitting that I'd had a mental issue and that I was seeking counselling for...
How did you manage that?
I'm still managing it. I think I joined the union. Basically, that's how I managed that. I joined the union. And I am not someone who is naturally a unionist, but I found that I had sought support through the normal mechanisms and I wasn't getting the support that I would expect to get, and so I had to seek it from other places.
United we stand, divided we fall.
Apparently.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry there's no more time for questions. We've bumped up against the clock. Fabulous discussion. Thank you, panelists. So please join me in thanking David Roubain, Professor Jill Milroy, Kimberly Olson, and Dr. Melanie Thompson.